I'm Allison Imhoff. I am currently the Director of Counseling and Client Services for a domestic violence and sexual assault victim servicing agency called SARC in Harford County, Maryland. I'll kind of explain the dynamics of Harford County and how this all kind of ties in. But first thing I want to do is I want to go over the learning objectives for this presentation. Hopefully after I'm done presenting, you'll have developed an understanding of factors that may increase intimate partner violence within military communities, explore barriers for reporting and seeking help, navigate rural culture, physical barriers that can limit connecting with victim assistance, discuss victim service and military partnerships. SARC actually has a memorandum of understanding with our local military base, which I'll go over, and identify resources and non-traditional assistance that can better reach survivors. So let's talk a little bit about the connection between rural communities and the military. Some of this might be common knowledge to many of you, but for those of you who aren't, I'm going to kind of go over some of the basics. Almost a quarter of all veterans in the United States, 4.4 million of from active military careers, reside in rural communities. Either they come from them and return to them, or they choose to settle in more of like a rural community. Veterans choose rural communities for a variety of reasons. Proximity to family, friends, and community, open space for more privacy, lower cost of living, or less crowded towns. And while veterans may enjoy the benefits of rural living, they may also experience rural healthcare challenges that are intensified by combat-related injuries and illnesses. It's no surprise that when you live further away from an urban area, access to different things and distance to certain resources is definitely greater. So let's talk about from the beginning. More than 44% of U.S. military recruits actually come from rural areas. Pentagon figures show, in contrast, 14% come from major cities. Youths living in the most sparsely populated zip codes are 22% more likely to join the army, which is opposite in trends, like in cities. A variety of reasons. When you live in more rural areas, there's not a whole lot of job opportunities. There's also a lot more of a push of going out and exploring outside of your normal hometown. It's not uncommon for people who are living in these rural areas to find themselves financially strapped. And nearly half of these recruits are coming from lower middle class or poor households. So it's not just that they're living in rural areas, it's that they're coming from low income areas as well. And again, majority of these recruits have rural roots, limited vocational educational options, and military incentives for post-high school youth can be very appealing. So this is kind of a map. I'm going to work on talking about rural populations that are connected to military survivors, and I'm also going to talk about intimate partner violence. So these two maps, ironically, are the similar colors, but the top one actually shows domestic violence trends throughout the nation. And then the bottom map actually shows where the majority of military recruits are coming from. So if you can actually see, there's actually quite a few trends. So even up along the East Coast, Maine specifically, and then down along the southern part of the nation, domestic violence and intimate partner numbers are significantly higher, and so are numbers of military recruits. So this is Maryland. So for any of you who are not familiar with Maryland, I'm probably going to be talking about it because it is my home base. But I wanted to kind of show where the reported crime numbers, these are specifically domestic violence incidents that are reported, but I also wanted to show the population density of each of these counties. So Maryland, for those of you who don't know, is actually called mini America because we have everything from the ocean to the mountains and everything in between. We have urban, we have suburban, and we have rural. So what I wanted to show is that there is a pretty interesting correlation between population density and a dramatic drop in things being reported. So for those of you who don't know, Prince George's County, Washington, D.C., sits right in the pocket of Prince George's and Montgomery County. So those are pretty urban areas, high density, a lot of commuters from DC. And then you have the East Coast, and then the far Garrett and Allegheny are actually our mountain ranges. So while the population is expected to be a lot lower in those areas, the reality is that it's not that low. The fact alone that the 5-year average of a domestic violence incident, we'll use Kent Island, for example. Kent Island is more of like a fisherman's community. There are some upper middle class or high, very well off vacation homes in that area, but the rest of them are pretty long-standing family fishing communities. So the fact alone that the 5-year average of a DV incident was only 48, I can't help but think that that is definitely a little bit underreported. Now you're going to look at like a Frederick County, for example. Frederick had 1,379 domestic violence incidents reported. Frederick is known for being a fairly rural, it's right on the cusp of farmland meets mountain ranges. So that actually makes sense. But you get further out into Garrett County, Allegheny County, there's no reason why a 5-year average should only be reporting, 95 incidents, whereas Allegheny County, which is just a little bit further inland and has a pretty similar population, is 4 times that amount. So how prevalent is violence and abuse in rural America? So again, these are just reported statistics. So sorry, I have to move one of my little bars every now and then. According to the 2019 federal crime statistics, violent crime rates in non-metropolitan areas were lower than the national average. However, the reality is a lot of them just are not getting reported. So this specifically talks about, we'll jump down to rape. So the US total, average total is 44. However, in non-metro communities or in populations of, this is actually, unfortunately, probably accurate, of populations of less than 10,000, it's higher than the national average. Aggravated assault, definitely a little bit lower across the board versus the US average, but it's definitely something to kind of keep in mind is, and I'll go into this here in a little bit, how much of the stuff is being reported is far more likely that in a rural area, people will want to take care of it themselves, or they're more concerned about people finding out and not actually getting the help that they need. The Bureau of Justice Statistics Criminal Victimization in 2016 notes that in rural areas, only 42% of violent crimes and 55.8% of serious violent crimes defined as rape or sexual assault, robbery, and aggravated assault are reported to the police. So I included this image at the bottom. For anyone who listens to country music, this song came out last year and it's called Wait in the Truck. And it basically tells a story of a guy driving home one night and he finds a woman who has been badly beaten along the side of the road. He doesn't know the woman, but he tells her to get in the truck, and he basically figures out that she has been the victim of domestic violence. And he proceeds to, in a glorified way, take care of the situation himself. He goes to the abuser's home and he ends up killing him. And then the rest of the song is about how he spends the rest of his life in jail and she still comes to visit him. So again, it was a glorified song, a very popular song. And I worked in domestic violence for the last 6 years. So I've worked in domestic violence when this song came out last year. And even our team had a very mixed reaction to this song. It was catchy, it was encouraging to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, it was encouraging, unfortunately, violence. So what happened? Why aren't people reporting in more of rural areas or non-metropolitan areas, depending on what you want to call it? According to the Bureau 2012 report, victims not reported to the police between 2006 and 2010. Reasons identified for non-reporting of violent crimes include they wanted to deal with themselves. It wasn't important enough for the victim to report. Maybe they were concerned about their reputation being damaged, or the consequences of reporting or making it public were more damaging than the actual assault at that time. The police would not or could not help. Fear of reprisal or getting offender in trouble. We'll kind of go over this here a little bit more in a minute. And other reasons, and not one more important reason for that. Like many other violent crimes in rural communities, sexual violence is underreported. Between 2006 and 2010, the average of 65% of rapes and sexual assaults were not reported. Speaking from professional experience, I oversee our team of hospital responders. We call them companions. And in order for our companions to come out, the survivor doesn't need to press charges. Sometimes they don't even necessarily opt for the part of a sexual assault or rape kit, or we call it a safe exam. That does take evidence, criminal evidence. They just want to get, plan B. They want to get checked for STIs. They want to get some of their injuries checked, and they just want to go home. While they do have a certain time frame in which they can still press charges, a lot of them choose not to, unfortunately, especially if they knew their assailant ahead of time, which is the majority of our cases. So let's talk a little bit about what is culture versus what is the line of a crime. So we're going to talk a little bit about one of the strategies of abusers is isolation. Well, the irony is, especially when you're working with military survivors, is there's often frequent moves involved, which causes, by default, isolation. A lot of the times when you are working with the military community, you're working with a community that has strong religious values. However, there's also an entire power and control wheel that talks about religious abuse. So also, along with military moves, it's not uncommon for military households to only have one income or to have limited external income for the non-military spouse, because the military member's career needs to come first to get the household needs met. However, financial abuse is also a strategy of different types of domestic violence abusers. There's also, for anyone who's worked with military survivors, untreated PTSD is huge. But we also work with trauma survivors who end up becoming abusers. So it's a matter of figuring out, do you have untreated PTSD and you need mental health services, or are you intentionally harming your partner out of malice? I'm also going to go into a lot about the age groups for people who join the military. It is very common for people in the military to get married at a very young age, start families very young, things like that. Often before the age of 25, which for those of us who are in mental health know that your brain is not done developing until your mid to late 20s. So is it a difference between being young and unprepared for the stressors and the traumas and the triggers of adult life, or is it a toxic relationship? So I'm going to go through a couple of domestic violence cases that I've actually worked with over time. And I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat just to kind of see what your guys' feedback is. So we're going to say this is going to be a game of basically domestic violence or a military family. So the family dynamic is 30-year-old male, history of anger since childhood, 22-year-old female, childhood history of sexual assault by parental uncle, married for 30 years, 2-year-old child, household income $50,000 a year, both sets of parents divorced, lives 3 hours from her family and 2+ hours from his parents. Do we think this is a military household, or do we think this is set up for domestic violence? We have both. Both. Could be either. I'll have a few of these, so just be aware. So some of the things that we've kind of talked about: history of anger since childhood, history of sexual assault by a family member, notable age difference, not crazy, but definitely notable. Household income for a family of 3, not crazy depending on where you're living in the country. And then both seem to be pretty far away from family. Oh, it says the spotlight was removed. Sorry, just a heads up. All right. Sounds good. All right, it says either. So this is a military family. They choose to live off base, which is definitely more of a financial strain, but it was the healthiest option for both of them. There was the military spouse was responsible for an assault on a family member. So that kind of leaves that there is some outstanding mental health and judgment that is of concern, but it was not intimate partner violence. They do qualify for social services as a family of 3 with $50,000 income. However, the military person refused any kind of assistance out of pride and principle. They have since received mental health support after that assault. So another case here: military or domestic violence. 28-year-old male, strong Hispanic family values. 26-year-old female, works part-time as a yoga instructor. 4-year-old child, household income $45,000 a year. Lives in an alternate state from both families. No college. History of jealousy, fighting, and pending homelessness. Do we think this is military or domestic violence? DV. We have DV in both. Military. This is both. The homelessness is due to being kicked out of on-base housing due to ongoing domestic violence. Rotating aggressor. So sometimes it's the military spouse, sometimes it's a not military spouse. Both had refused to press charges for fear of losing all of the military benefits. They were already on the military's radar and had already gotten kicked off base. Neither one of them were willing to actually press formal charges. They did seek support from a civilian agency. And then even, can I ask what information about their race is relevant here? Honestly, I'll kind of tie in different tidbits of the household dynamics. In this situation, I only included his race, but sometimes I'll include the victim's race, or I'll include both of their stuff, just to kind of give you a visual about different dynamics in the household. And then there was, even after strong Catholic values and cultural dynamics, there was actually a tremendous pull from his family to stay in the marriage due to cultural values that he had actually identified in this situation. So, and then accusations of military extramarital affairs with colleagues even after they had separated. In this particular situation, the military spouse actually wanted a divorce, and the non-military spouse did not want to risk losing the benefits. She was not cooperative. Another DV case here, or a military and DV case: 32-year-old male, severe OCD with binge drinking, grew up in rural poverty. Okay. 30-year-old female, works out of household. 1 night a week, only 1 night a week, 7-year-old and 5-year-old children, household income significantly higher, $150,000 a year. Lives in another state from her family and 1 hour from his family. Both sets of parents are divorced, history of alcoholism in both families. Bachelor's degree for both. Do we think this is a military or domestic violence case? DV, military, both. Both. All right. So the biggest concerns here is severe OCD with binge drinking, definitely higher income, so probably easier to hide things if it is a DV case. Not enough info to determine. And that's the kicker for all of these. There's often not enough info from the get-go. This is just military. Male saw DV in several of their mother's relationships while growing up, control issues, but he internalizes them. This particular situation, he was higher ranking in the military. And because of his impoverished upbringing, he turned that into wanting to not ever identify with that again. However, he internalizes a lot of his mental health needs. He just doesn't necessarily put it onto his partner. All right, another case, military DV study, 70-year-old male, history of homelessness, 55-year-old female, history of homelessness, not married, but long-term relationship. Alcohol abuse for both, no children. Do we think this is military or DV? DV, military, DV, military and DV. In this particular situation, she is the veteran, but we had been working with her for over 5 months before we actually found out she was a veteran. She had actually intentionally told us she was not a veteran because she did not feel she was entitled to any veteran benefits. So she actually refused all veteran benefits, including housing support. She actually would have preferred to have been homeless and having to gone through the VA. After years of abuse, she actually, the identified victim, survivor, actually planned a murder-suicide. The plan actually was interrupted and mobile crisis was called. Once separated, there was no further concern of DV, but addictions and several mental health cause ongoing barriers. Happens every day. Yeah. She ended up being okay, but we worked with her on and off for about 5 years, and she has never been open to getting VA supports. Military DV case, 45-year-old female, OCD, history of urban community violence. On the last scenario, mental health, yes, definitely. 43-year-old female, so this is a dual female relationship. 43-year-old female, childhood history of homelessness and urban community violence. 14-year-old and 10-year-old children, household income $65,000 a year, lives in an alternate state from both families. 14-year-old child has a history of suicidal ideation and sexual assault. Do we think this is military, DV, or both? We have one both. Both military, both DV. Both. Active duty and a vet and DV. The 45-year-old was active duty. The 43-year-old medically discharged. Younger female fled to a safe house with 10-year-old. 14-year-old refused to leave the military parents' home, refused to take any legal claims due to their fear of losing benefits. Are we noticing a trend here? Wanted older military spouse to surrender the family home despite them being the only income. Talked more about status and safety in case management, returned to shared home within 2 weeks. In this particular situation, the identified survivor found it more difficult walking away from the military status that they had felt that they had worked towards for their entire life, and they did not want to even let their family members know because their family was still living in that community that it had exposed them to childhood community violence. And as far as their community was concerned and their family was concerned, they had made it. They had broken all the generational curses. They were living in a gated community, and they were the rock stars of the family. So outside of not wanting to break, what their status looked like within their inner circle, they also did not want to lose any of the benefit. If you're losing benefits and financial support, you got it. All right, that was the last one. Thank you guys for participating. I really appreciate it. So we're going to talk a little bit more about military norms and rural culture. Again, if this is old news to any of you guys, please just bear with me. I really appreciate it. So we talked a little bit about isolation. So living in a rural area, one thing that most people really, really struggle with is phone service and Wi-Fi. In the first couple of weeks of COVID, out by us in northern Harford County, it's extremely rural, and the school system quickly realized that a lot of people did not have working Wi-Fi for students to actually be able to log on for virtual schooling. So what did the school system do? They put a Wi-Fi hotspot in the school parking lot, which meant that students had to drive to the school and do schoolwork from their cars if they had the cars available all day long. So this is definitely something to keep in mind. The isolation, sometimes people gravitate towards more rural communities, but communication is definitely a huge factor. Animals. For those of you who work in domestic violence shelters, you know that we will often lose survivors coming to get help because they are not willing to leave their animals behind. However, when you live in a rural community, you often have more than one animal. So you're automatically further isolating people in these communities. Transportation. It's not uncommon for military households to have limited vehicles. You have the one person who, if they live off base, they need to be able to use the most reliable car to get to and from base. So if one car is out of commission, or if they only have one car, that leaves someone basically stranded at the house. Public transportation in rural areas is almost non-existent. In some of the areas around me, good luck finding an Uber. And then there's limited work opportunities in rural communities. Then on top of it, let's say someone is a National Guard person and they have to go in 1 week in a month. They have to go in for drill. So that automatically rules out their spouse being able to have as flexible of a schedule even after normal business hours. Frequent moves and rental. So sometimes people in the military do have to make frequent moves, which makes them less appealing for different employers. I know there's a lot of laws in place to try to protect this. However, it is a reality. So moving every 2 years at the end of a term is not necessarily ideal for someone to invest in, like advancement in a career, or this kind of ties into the next one, childcare needs. Out by me, I'll show you guys a map, but Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which is our local military base, I'm actually within 40 minutes of probably 3 to 4 different military bases. But Aberdeen Proving Grounds is our home local military base, and it takes up about a quarter of our county. So every single household that I am familiar with has someone who works on Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Aberdeen Proving Grounds employs over 20,000 people and is our county's biggest employer. My husband is civilian, works for the Army. My brother-in-law is active duty. If you are near Rising Sun, I understand, yes, I am within a 30-minute drive of Rising Sun. And Rising Sun is very, very much like our rural areas in Harford County. So again, deployment childcare needs. My sister-in-law is getting ready to be a solo parent again when my brother-in-law gets deployed. and their household, it made sense for her to not work outside of the home and just to be able to provide ongoing childcare needs, because he deploys every 2 years, typically for 9 months to 12 months at a time. Deep religious Christian culture. Again, this is just general out by me. The primary religion of a lot of our military survivors is Christian. So there's a lot of religious tie-in to very traditional values. Nationalism and traditional values, also a lot of pride, military pride, national pride, ties along with traditional family dynamics as well. And then this is kind of a given. Within rural communities, there's a lot of guns culture. And by default, and probably due to trainings, there's also a tremendous gun culture within military households as well. So rural culture means everyone works in the same jobs, knows what's going on in each other's lives, and that means police, judges, social services, healthcare workers, and faith leaders are known to both the survivor and the abusive partners. So what does confidential look like when you know everyone's uncle? How can survivors actually be sure that their jobs and basic social needs are protected if they seek help? Out by me, while we do have a lot of people who are first generation to the county, full disclosure, I'm 6th generation of this home of my county. I've grown up in a rural family. And because of that, it is extremely uncommon that I go out to even just run errands and I don't run into either a second cousin or someone I went to high school with. If I need my driveway paved, plumbing done, electrical work, chances are I either went to high school with them or I know someone that went to high school with them. Unfortunately, in my line of work, it is not uncommon for me to also identify victims and abusers based off of our social connections. So just something to always keep in mind, especially when you're working with rural survivors. They need extra trust that what you talk about is confidential and it won't necessarily come back to bite them. Let's see. I'm trying to keep up with the chat, so if I miss something, please bear with me. So this talks a little bit about, we talked a little bit about isolation and cell phone service and Wi-Fi. So as you can see, this basically shows the dramatic drop in cell phone availability. So full disclosure, out by me, if you don't have Verizon, you're not even going to get a baby bar. So we heavily rely on Wi-Fi. So if I have any vendors that come out to my house and they need to make a phone call, they actually have to connect to my Wi-Fi because they're not going to get service. Out in the mountains of Maryland, I can pretty much guarantee you that you're going to have to probably drive for about 10 miles before you get Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, or Sprint service. And so this is just something to kind of keep in mind. So even in my agency, we give people track phones. So let's say their phone has either been damaged, stolen, or they're worried about their abuser tracking their calls. We do give out track phones, but we also have to get people connected with SIM cards just to make sure that they can't necessarily, sometimes they can't hook into Wi-Fi. And we also work to actually give out Wi-Fi boosters if needed. So just something to keep in mind. We talked a little bit about animals. So this is Red Rover. So this basically shows the number of survivors who will return to their abuser because they don't want to risk their animal being abused or neglected, or the abuser uses the animal as a means to kind of reunify the family. It is extremely difficult to accommodate animals. However, I did want to share a little bit about what my agency currently does. We have a partnership with our local Humane Society, which basically the Humane Society identifies specific foster care homes that will take in animals temporarily that are not open for adoption, but they just basically shelter the animal for up to 6 months while the survivor is in a safe house and working to get stabilized. The survivor is still responsible for all veterinary care and cannot necessarily have access to the animal in those 6 months due to their safety and the animal safety. We recently built a $7 million safe house. We had a 28-bed safe house for a long time, and then we spent about 10 years working to build a 40-bed safe house. And our current safe house does have a dog and cat shelter. It is a totally different beast. We have always taken in survivors that have service animals. Yes, so we've always had a separate policy for service animals. Emotional support animals do not fall under the same federal protection. However, we do try to make accommodations as we can. So in the new 40-bed safe house, instead of having communal rooms, it's actually pods. So we actually always check to see if, if someone has, an animal that's actually going to be residing with them in the pod due to being a service animal, or we're making an accommodation for an emotional support animal. We actually check to make sure that their roommates don't have any allergies and is okay with being in that room with them. Otherwise, we will actually match them up with a different roommate. If it is just a household pet, or until we can actually get all vaccination records or things like that, or let's say they only like their owner, that's it. We actually do have a kennel, and we're actually working on putting in a doggy run at the moment. However, it's all great, but there are a lot of policies. As you all know, working with trauma survivors, sometimes they can barely take care of themselves, let alone a pet. So our staff has to be regularly and thoroughly trained in identifying client abilities to take care of the pet. We had a dog come into us where the survivor didn't have the financial means to get it veterinary care. And we quickly realized that the dog should have had a lot more hair on it than it actually did. So we did have to quarantine that animal for a period of time, and the survivor is responsible for getting the pet up and vaccinated, taking it out every 3 to 4 hours. And if they can't take it out, they have to have an agreement with another client to take the pet out, because staff cannot be one-on-one with the pets, just in case the animal does become aggressive. In my first 2 months of working at SARC, we had someone literally show up with a little Yorkie poodle mix, saying that it was her daughter's emotional support animal. And this dog was not well. This dog was not well. This dog had not been properly taken care of. It was extremely reactive, and the owner ended up having a seizure and not taking care of the animal for a prolonged period of time. So my staff decided the only humane thing to do was to actually take the dog out themselves. And when they went to go put the dog back into the crate, the dog became reactive and bit the staff. Because we didn't have the documentations at that time, because the dog was supposed to be in quarantine, the staff member had to go through all of the rabies vaccinations. However, we have had also the dog that didn't have a whole lot of hair that did need medical treatment. We were able to get the dog and the human stabilized, and they were able to go and live independently after the safe house. It is a lot of work. With great reward, but it is a lot of work. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. I would never deter any shelter from creating a kennel or a relationship with a kennel, but I just want anyone to know, like, if anyone has any questions because they're interested in starting it, please, I'm going to have my contact information at the end. We stand by having the kennel. We did have, in our first situation, we did have a dog and a ferret. We were not prepared for the ferret, but we made accommodations. And the reality is on our team, not a single staff member was upset with us taking in any of the animals. In fact, we just had to pull them back because they wanted to engage with the animals more than they were actually permitted to. But at the end of the day, it could save the person's life and it could save the animal's life. Once you get over the smell, they're sweet. This one, once we got over, we had to treat fleas, but it was lovely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation. So this orange map here, this is my home county. This is Harford County. The dark orange is where the most densely populated areas are. And the striped area at the bottom is Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Ironically, they have almost all of the waterfront property. Aberdeen Proving Grounds kind of sticks out into the Chesapeake Bay of Maryland. So you can see, much like many other military areas, the most densely populated areas of our county border the military base. I describe Harford County as the layers of the earth, basically. So you have the core, which is basically Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And then you have the next level, which is the dark orange, most densely populated area. And this is the 95 corridor. So anybody who's familiar with I-95 or Route 40, this is technically called the business district of Harford County. It's a term that was assigned to this area during the civil rights movement. It is where a lot of people have traveled and migrated from Baltimore City or Cecil County, and they've kind of settled along that 95 Route 40 corridor. It is a lot of people who do work on base, either civilian or military, and there is a lot of lower income housing in this area. There's a ton of businesses, there's a ton of fast food, there's a ton of truck stops, things like that. So that is the Route 40 corridor. The next layer of the earth is kind of where this orange part goes up in the middle. And where the orange part kind of circles is Bel Air. Bel Air is considered the heart of Harford. It is where all of our courthouses are, where the nicer police stations are, where the mall is. And it is basically suburbia. You would be hard pressed to find a main street outside of Main Street Bel Air that looks more Main Street. Used to drive a school bus in this area when we were stationed in Everett. Yep. So you know the area pretty well, I guess. So Bel Air area is traditional middle America suburbia. This is where you'll see the police blotter of someone stole beef jerky out of somebody's car, basically. And then above Bel Air, we have a pretty thin border of extreme wealth. It is people who have made their money in the metropolitan area surrounding here, but it is six-figure plus households. And then right above that, you have an immense rural population. I believe Bel Air is a bit safer than Baltimore. Most of the time. I spent 10 years working in Baltimore City doing home visits. Harford County is my home. My biggest pet peeve is when people think that they are so far removed from people who live literally 30 minutes away. A large part of my friends' households growing up were actually people who came from blue collar roots and who worked in the steel industry. And then when the steel industry kind of downsized in the 80s and 90s, they migrated up to Harford County. So it's a lot of people who do have, honestly, blue collar roots, but they're like a generation removed, so they have a tendency to forget that. I worked in CPS in Baltimore too. Hey. So the top area of Harford County is called North Harford. I'm going to give you a little stereotypical information about North Harford. North Harford High School has something called Bring Your Tractor to Work Day. And it is their favorite day of the year. And there is posts that go out on all of the emergency response Facebook pages, lots of dairy farms, yes. And so it's one of those things where it is a huge pride factor. for the rural communities in North Hartford, and it does border Pennsylvania. So they have their, one of the biggest things in that area is the Mason-Dixon Fair every year, where there's lots of tractor pulls. Like pretty soon here, we're going to have our local farm fair, where they're doing everything from dog jumping contests to rodeos. Like it is just part of the cultural norms for a lot of people. However, a lot of people in the military bases don't necessarily come from this local rural area. A lot of our military families actually come from New Jersey. So some come from Dover, some come from Montgomery County. Some of our closest friends actually were stationed here after being in Washington State. So this is kind of a little bit of a confusing thing for some of them. But do you have cow patty bingo? I don't know if we do. I hope we do. If not, we need to recommend it. There is like a mullet judging contest at the local farm fair coming up here soon. Let's also talk about people with disabilities. We've talked about isolation. We've talked about less of a community factor, less resources. So people with disabilities living in living in a rural area, the accessibility. So the Bel Air Town Go Round is the local bus. I'm going to actually go back here in a visual. Hold on, let me show you. So the dark lines on this map is actually where Hartford County's only public transportation system goes. So you can see there's a huge part of the county that is untouched by any type of public transportation. And I call it the Bel Air Town Go Round because they're the short little blue buses. And some of them are handicap accessible and some of them are not. They do not run on the weekends and they stop running at, I think, 6 o'clock every night. So while it is a great resource for the people who live and commute along these black lines, the reality is the entire rural population of our county does not have access to public transportation. And the majority of our county does not have access to things like Lyft or Uber. And if it does, you'll be waiting about 45 to 90 minutes for a ride. So that basically means anyone with a physical disability or a traumatic brain injury might be even more isolated than usual. A lot of times they have less of a community, either due to mental health struggles or just not being connected to people who have similar abilities or disabilities. They are more likely to have caregivers, which adds a whole nother level of people in control of their lives that may either use the power over that person for good or not good. They're less seen. They have more of a risk for medical crisis and go untreated. So Hartford County has 2 hospitals. One is in heart of Bel Air. And the other one just moved from Havre de Grace, which is the far end, to Aberdeen. So it's just above our military base, which basically means if someone is having a medical crisis in North Hartford, they're more likely to be medevac to Baltimore and getting there sooner than getting to either one of their local hospitals. We are very focused on the cow patty bingo, and I appreciate that. Disability resources. So something to kind of keep in mind for these more rural populations or people with disabilities is Medicaid transport. For any of you who don't know, Medicaid transport can be provided to anybody who is receiving Medicaid for doctor's appointments or regular mental health appointments. The provider has to fill out a form, I believe at least 24 to 48 hours ahead. No, the provider has to fill out a form and then the person has to call and make the appointment for Medicaid transport at least 24 to 48 hours ahead of their appointment, which basically means the Medicaid transport will get there within a certain window prior to their appointment and try to get them to that appointment in a timely fashion. But it does require several additional steps and several renewal processes. PRP, psychiatric rehabilitation programs. These are definitely a huge benefit to a lot of our clients who may be more isolated. They can also be seen as respite. It's like, for any of you who doesn't know, I describe it as mental health mentor, big brother, big sister for either youth or adults. It is a tremendous support for people in building their villages. One of the biggest isolation factors is people don't feel connected to a village. So having a PRP is a great addition for anybody who does need additional socialization or time away out of the house or just basic household needs. Coordinated care through local DDA. Does the VA provide medical transportation? I honestly don't know. So if anybody does know that answer, please feel free to jump in. Walter Reed Hospital is a huge factor, is a huge benefit for Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. I actually have close friends that work there, and a tremendous medical facility. And then long-term care supports, figuring out if people really should live in the rural community, or if they would be better off moving closer to their doctor's appointments in a smaller, possibly even more isolated area, because their family may still live in the rural area. All right, we're gonna kind of switch gears a little bit here. Reality is the average age of first marriage for those in the study was 22. With this is the military age for people going into marriage. So people who were in the military ended up getting married 4 years younger than people outside the military. And I think this is something really important. So for, again, those of you who ever work in neurobiology, know that typical human's brain is not finished developing until they're in their mid to sometimes late 20s. So these are people who are jumping into major responsibility through their career, through marriage, and a lot of times they do start a family pretty young as well. So those 4 years are pretty critical in developing their decision-making skills, their coping strategies, and making sure that they are honoring their needs as well as their spouse's needs. So deployment, employment, and childcare. We talked a little bit about this, but deployment needs. Again, I'm going to use my brother and sister-in-law as an example. It was more realistic for my sister-in-law to not have employment outside of the home, just due to needing to prioritize my brother-in-law's military career. So National Guard, we talked a little bit about this already. Drill weekends are definitely make scheduling a little bit more complex. Frequent moves, preventing non-military partner steady employment. Childcare costs. Anybody who has had to pay for out-of-home childcare knows that it is not uncommon for the non-top grossing spouse to just stay home and take care of the kids. Out by me, childcare for one child is anywhere from $1,200 to $2,000 a month, and that is one child. And then the pandemic changed a lot. I know many households and many close friends and family who, after the pandemic, they reassessed their entire household structure and determined that with any flare up, they were going to have to keep their kid home. Sick days look a little bit different now. And the reality is a majority of part-time employers or employers who are flexible about drill weekends and deployments and military needs, you have one too many sick days and they're going to basically write you off. So religion. Abuse is often a taboo subject in faith communities. Victims may feel obligated to stay with their abuser because of their religious beliefs. In many faiths, marriage is a holy union. Divorce is rarely, never an option. Therefore, partners who are married to an abuser often feel a religious obligation to stay. So, What's more, studies show that leaders from many major religion groups encourage couples to stay together even if abuse is involved. Because marriage is seen as sacred, leaders encourage couples to seek counseling and work on their relationship when in some cases staying puts the victim in greater danger. There is a whole power and control wheel that has to do with religious abuse, not just Christian. There's one for Muslim and as well as several others. So I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but I'm going to drop a little bit here. One of the greatest strengths that we've been able to pull on as a service providing agency is actually developing relationships with religious leaders in the area. One of our absolute favorite supporters of our safe house is actually Rabbi Koshi, and he is the local Jewish religious leader in our community, and he's amazing. He will literally hand deliver someone to us if he is concerned about their safety. So I encourage everyone to not necessarily see religious leaders as an opposition, but actually try to engage them and educate them. And because the reality is they have so much respect and they have so much insight into people's personal lives that they might actually be able to identify domestic violence sooner than anybody else. But again, religion as a weapon. Abusers who are part of the faith community may use spiritual abuse to further isolate or control their victims. Spiritual abuse includes tactics like taking religious teachings or scriptures out of context to manipulate behavior, using religion to shame a partner or their children, and forcing them to adhere to certain spiritual practices. This is the spiritual and religion abuse power and control wheel. So I'm going to leave this up for a little bit. You guys are more than welcome to do screenshots or anything like that. But it talks about isolation, using community coercion, blaming the victim, restricting access or use to health care. So they might say it's not in our religion to do X, Y, or Z. Birth control, for example, using children, controlling sexual reproduction, asserting authority, and prolonged abusive relationships. Oh, good. So slides are available in the student corner as well. Yep, they in the military, you do have to go through a certain grace period before you are permitted to actually formally separate. So any of you who are in the military or close to the military has already seen this Uniform Code of Military Justice. There's a specific section that actually talks about domestic violence. So any person who commits a violent offense against a spouse or intimate partner or immediate family member of that person, and it talks about the different expectations as to how to classify domestic violence. And then it talks about some of the consequences that can occur. Now, for those of you who are already connected to the military, you know that there are different protective orders and peace orders, depending on if you're living on base or a military protective order versus a civilian protective order. So there's a lot of information as advocates just to kind of be aware of. We have a lot of people in our community that work on base but live off base. So we have to talk with them on a regular basis about the reality of needing possibly both a military and a civilian protective order. A lot of people do opt out of the military protective order out of concern that things will get to their higher up in command and, jeopardize their benefits, but definitely something to kind of keep in mind. So this is a little bit about military protective order versus civilian protective order. Both of them don't have any cost to the victim. The cons of a military protective order may only enforce on a military institution. If the offender moves to a different institution, a new military protective order is needed, and they are typically short-term. Pros and cons for a civilian protective order. Distinct types of protections are available, which is great. For both of these, there needs to be reminder if there are children involved that have shared custody, that things need to be communicated when the protective order is sought. And then cons for civilian, they're slower to obtain. Hearing needs to be held, which may require the victim to be in the same room as the offender. We've been able to navigate this a little bit for some extreme cases and do things virtually through our legal team. However, the reality is most courts in our country are going to require the abuser and the victim to be in the same room, typically about 15 feet away from each other. So how to help? We've talked a lot about common trends, about things to kind of be aware of. At the end of the day, my goal for a lot of you is just to know the barriers and your resources. Know how and when to. We have a whole grant dedicated for us just to be able to pay for Ubers for clients. Getting a client to and from outside lawyer's office, getting a client to and from Department of Social Services to get food stamps. Those things can be tremendous in getting someone stabilized within a short turnaround time. Knowing where all of your community's food pantries are, both officially and unofficially. Teletherapy and case management. When COVID happened, we moved all of our clinicians to teletherapy. We thought it was just going to be short term. And while there is still tremendous need for in-person counseling for people with severe mental health or who may be hiding things or not speaking things and maybe showing them in a nonverbal way, the reality is for trauma survivors, teletherapy and telecase management has been a game changer. It doesn't require them to have transportation. It doesn't require them to have childcare, and it allows them the opportunity to have regular and ongoing services without additional stressors. Sometimes we don't even mind if they're doing it from their lunch break in their car. And that just means that they're getting all their needs met and they're using their free time to actually get some help. There's also the option of a remote protective order as well. So they made it so that people could start getting protective orders while getting treated in hospitals after assaults. And it has been tremendous. Now it's just the initial, it's just the interim and the temporary protective order. They do still have to go to court for their final protective order, but being able to do it remotely is phenomenal. It means people don't need to actually go to the commissioner's office or go to the courthouse. And it just makes a huge difference. Make sure that you connect with all medical providers. So we have relationships with various different OBGYNs around the area in case someone has ongoing genital trauma. We have relationships with the local crisis center and both of the hospitals, to the point that if one of our clients needs to go in for either a safe exam or a follow-up visit and we're concerned about someone seeing them or following them, we actually have an agreement with our local hospital to actually have a code purple, which means that over the intercom it says code purple, and they actually bring us in through a non-public entrance and take us immediately into a private room so that no one can see them outside of the professionals. So I just encourage you all to try to do the same if you can. Again, if you have any questions, my contact will be at the end of this. Track phones with SIM cards, I talked a little about that. We also freely give out home security cameras. We filled out a grant and got a large amount of Ring doorbell cameras. And then on top of it, we also use the Wise Amazon cameras, which does not require a subscription. You can get them on Amazon for like $40 a piece. We give them out to clients. So like if a client has an apartment, we'll give them one camera for the front door. If they have a townhouse or a single family home, we give them at least two. And then that way it's just more of peace of mind. They can use it for documentation if there is concern about someone being there. But the reality is it allows them to sleep at night. They'll get a notification if someone's outside their house. And it makes a huge difference in being able to keep people safe in their own homes. And then we also provide daycare support, resume building, and then relocation funds, which I talked a little bit about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding in the civilian agencies and military resources. I work for a victim servicing agency, a nonprofit in the civilian side, but we have a memorandum of understanding with Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which basically says Aberdeen Proving Grounds will refer any identified abuser to our abuser intervention program, which is another program that is fully remote. There is no need for any of the identified abusers to be at our administrative offices or anywhere near our victims if we can prevent it. However, one of the other perks of our memorandum of understanding with Aberdeen Proving Grounds is if they have an assault that occurs on base and they feel that they cannot safely keep the survivor and the abuser separate or keep the survivor away from retaliatory consequences, they will actually deliver the survivor to us for us to keep them safe. So we take great pride that our local military junction feels that if they can't keep someone safe, we can. Because at the end of the day, we're a bunch of social workers and counselors, but we take our job and the safety of our buildings extremely seriously. And we take great pride that they trust us with protecting their survivors. And then invite yourself to the party. Don't be afraid to go out and make a friend. This has to do with marketing. It is not uncommon for us to go to our local restaurants and stuff like that and hand out, posters and see if they're willing to put them in their front doors. So much so that it is not uncommon for some of our local pizzerias or stuff like that to show up at our admin office after hours just with like a tray of lasagna, knowing that we'll get them to our survivors. And they don't even say anything when they drop it off. They just say, here, take it. So honestly, make friends. You never really know until they really come through for you how much it really does make a difference. Partnering with churches and 4-H. 4-H is a huge player in rural communities and churches, definitely in rural communities, because it's where most of the food pantries are. Out by us in the wintertime, when it gets below a certain temperature, we have something called a rotating cold weather shelter. And it is a rotating shelter that goes from church to church to church, that one church will sign up for housing the street homeless population for a week or two, and then it moves to the next church, and then moves to the next church. And each of these churches have typically a clothing pantry or a food pantry. And at the end of the day, it ties back to those religious leaders that we really need to befriend. And then untaboo it. So much about intimate partner violence are topics that people don't want to discuss. They don't want to believe that it's in their community. And that by itself isolates so many of our survivors. We always talk about victim blaming. Well, the reality is why do people victim blame? It's to separate themselves from something that scares them. They want to blame somebody for being in a scary situation so that the person blaming feels like they are far removed from that situation and should never have to worry about it themselves. We do remote base with military fleet, families to our key spouses, chaplain, sapper, lower gap. Yes, and please do connect with as many bilingual people as possible. We have a bilingual legal advocate on staff, and then we also have bilingual client advocates as well. And it makes a huge difference if you do not need to use the language line. All right. So this is another program. Oh, let me go back. This is another program I want you guys to kind of just take note of. This is the role program funds projects that implement and expand and establish cooperative efforts among law enforcement officers, prosecutors, victim service providers, and other related parties to investigate and prosecute incidents of sexual assault, DV, dating violence, and stalking. It provides treatment, advocacy, counseling, legal services, or other victim services to victims in rural communities, or develop and strengthen programs to address sexual assault, like sexual assault response teams, which if your communities don't have one, I highly encourage it. A sexual assault response team basically goes over any of the stagnant sexual assault kits that have occurred and determine if the county should move forward with testing them, even if the victim isn't interested in pressing charges. It allows for a database of DNA evidence and investigative material that can help build cases if there is another sexual assault done by the same perpetrator. So if your community doesn't have a SART, I strongly encourage you to see how you can get one started. And then sexual assault nurse examiner programs. Have you worked with the Amish community? We are actually really, really close to a huge Amish population, and we have had, in my time at SARC, I think we've had 2 cases that were connected to the Amish community. Both cases, the assailant was not in the community. One was a known perpetrator and one was an unknown perpetrator. Both were willing to get medical treatment, but not really anything else. They were not interested in long-term supports. They very much turned to their local religious leaders. But overall, we were just happy that they were willing to at least get the medical treatment. So just something to kind of keep in mind for anybody who is looking to start programs. The rural program has given out a lot of money to assist the exact population that we are talking about here. So move this around. So hypothetical rural communities. Service member SM Jones is active duty military. SM Jones is married to Jennifer, who has never served in the military. SM Jones and Jennifer have 3 children: Micah, 3 years old, Cheyenne, 12 years old, and Dakota, 18 years old. Micah and Cheyenne are biological children of SM Jones and Jennifer. Dakota is SM Jones's biological child and Jennifer's stepchild. SM Jones, Sergeant Major Jones is stationed in a remote part of Alaska. Sergeant Major Jones, Jennifer, and their 3 children live together on the installation. So keep that in mind. 3 children, 1 child is not both of theirs, living in a remote part of Alaska. The military community Jennifer and Sergeant Major Jones lives in with their children is rural and remote. Service member Jones, my bad, service member Jones. Their children is rural and remote. Jennifer is unemployed and lacks access to reliable vehicle or cell phone service. Keep in mind, they're in a rural part of Alaska. Sometimes it can take days getting to the local town. Jennifer is connected to a civilian community-based victim advocate about past physical domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking by service member Jones. During this contact, Jennifer expressed current concerns for their safety and their 3 children's safety if they continue to live on base with service member Jones. The advocate is beginning to explore with Jennifer their reporting advocacy and safety planning options. So number 1, keeping in mind, she has limited cell phone service. She lives in a rural area. She has 3 children. While she is the stepmother of 1, she may not actually have legal guardianship of Dakota. And she has no income, and there's a past history of domestic violence. So hypothetical questions. What are some considerations related to Jennifer's remote rural location that advocates will need to incorporate into their examination and exploration of Jennifer's reporting, advocacy, and safety planning options? So what are some of the barriers and considerations that we need to keep in mind? Transportation, housing and financial resources, blended family, communication, access to resources, communication, very much so. How she can contact people or help for emergencies and support. Yep. Safety nearest police station and hospital, childcare, resources. Perfect. What are some ways community-based civilian advocates can address the challenges that military-connected victims in rural communities face, such as limited job opportunities, limited childcare, and limited public transportation? So we've identified some of the concerns. How can we address some of these concerns, such as job opportunities, limited childcare, and limited public transportation? Provide transportation. See if there's a lemon lot for a cheap car. Get Creative, Education Grants, Vouchers, Networks. I would argue in this situation, actually ask where Jennifer's from. Chances are she's not from that rural part of Alaska. See if there's a more realistic home base that even if there is a dramatic change, seeing if she would be willing to actually relocate back home, either short-term or long-term. Now working for job care, confidentiality advocacy. Yeah, awesome. If Jennifer wants a lawyer, like we talked about in the last session, is there in the last session, are there unique challenges that they might face in finding representation? So in her location, for sure. Small town, potential conflicts of interest, financial consideration, distance to lawyer, number of available lawyers, pro bono legal services. Yeah, awesome, guys. You guys are doing great. All right. So I feel like it was a pretty quick recap, but I wanted to make sure that we were respectful of everyone's time. This is my email, and this is our helpline. So if anybody has any questions, develop an MOU, MOA for support, heck yeah. So if anyone is interested in and wants to develop an MOU with the local military base or a victim service agency, please send me an email. I'm more than happy to share our existing MOU with anybody. I would actually really encourage any victim servicing agency and military junction to develop a memorandum of understanding. It helps get people connected both on the civilian side and the military side. So I am more than happy to share that. It has already been approved through all of the military legal advisors and all that stuff. So you're more than welcome to copy it and try to duplicate it. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But otherwise, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.